Hello. In this segment, we'll talk about how the government can influence the short-run economic fluctuations that we experience in our economy through government policies, such as monetary policy and fiscal policy. So first, let's take a look and revisit what we mean by the long-run equilibrium. So as you can see here, we have the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, where our long-run aggregate supply curve is meeting our short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve right at this given price level. This is what we call the long-run equilibrium, where all three of our curves meet. And at this point, we have what we call the natural rate of output. So in the long-run equilibrium, our economy is producing at the natural rate of output, which means that the economy, or GDP, is at the level where the economy is operating at full employment. So recall that when we think about full employment, this reflects the natural rate of unemployment. So when we say the natural rate of output, this is telling us that our economy is producing at the natural rate of unemployment, or at full employment. So when we look at the natural rate of unemployment, this is the unemployment rate that reflects only structural and frictional factors in the economy. So we've stripped away the cyclical unemployment that may occur due to economic fluctuations. Okay, so what happens when we have deviations from the long-run equilibrium? Well, we can have these shocks that occur in the economy that cause deviations away from the long-run equilibrium. So what we would observe is that either changes in aggregate demand or changes in the short-run aggregate supply would cause us to deviate from this long-run equilibrium point right here. Therefore, if we have changes either in this direction or in this direction, we see that output or production, our GDP, is deviating away from the natural rate of output. In other words, that means that the economy is producing at a point where the unemployment rate is no longer equal to the natural rate of unemployment, and we are no longer at this full employment level. We'll explain that in a few more minutes. What we observe then is that when these temporary shocks occur in the economy, the government can use monetary and fiscal policy to try to stabilize the effects of these shocks. And that's what we want to focus on in this segment of the course. So let's think about how government policies can impact aggregate demand. There are two ways, and we've already explored these in the previous segments. Through monetary policy, where the Federal Reserve or the central bank is changing the money supply, which therefore changes interest rates. When we have a change in the money supply, this is going to influence the interest rates that we have in the economy, which therefore causes a change in investment spending. The more responsive investment spending is to a change in interest rates, the greater the impact of monetary policy on aggregate demand. So remember, our aggregate demand curve can be characterized as through the output equation. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. So with a change in investment spending through the change in the money supply, we're directly affecting aggregate demand. On the other hand, when we look at fiscal policy, this is showing the impact of government spending and taxes on aggregate demand. The change in government spending directly affects aggregate demand through the output equation. But taxes, remember, impact consumption spending. With higher tax rates, we see that households have less disposable income. So they're not going to be able to spend as much on goods and services in the economy, and consumption spending will be lower. On the other hand, if the government cuts taxes and tax rates are lower, then households have more disposable income to spend on goods and services in the economy, and consumption will be higher. So the impact of tax policy on aggregate demand will be through the influence on consumption spending. So what would cause short-run economic fluctuations? When we look at these fluctuations, these are deviations from the long-run equilibrium. They can come from either demand shocks or supply-side shocks. let's think about demand side shocks first. So if there are demand side shocks, we observe changes in aggregate demand. What this is showing us is that if we look at our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, where we have our output, our price level, aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply, and our long-run aggregate supply, demand-side shocks tell us that with an increase in aggregate demand, we would observe aggregate demand curve shifting out, and we move from a point such as equilibrium A, the long-run equilibrium, to this new equilibrium B in the short run. Price levels rise, output rises, so we have a fall in unemployment. On the other hand, if we look at the decrease in aggregate demand, we see that aggregate demand is shifting in this direction. And therefore, we move from an equilibrium, such as equilibrium A, to an equilibrium in the short run, such as B. Here we observe a fall in the price level and a decrease in production, telling us that unemployment is now rising because the economy is producing less. On the other hand, when we look at short-run supply shocks, these are changes in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So once again, let's take a look at our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Price level, long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply. So with an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve, what do we observe? Well, here we're moving to an increase in the short-run aggregate supply from A to B. We see that price levels are falling and output is rising. On the other hand, if we see a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply moves in this direction, and we move from A to B, a new short-run equilibrium. Prices are higher and output is lower. So here we see a rise in inflation and a rise in unemployment. So now we want to think about what happens if we have a demand-side shock. So let's take a minute and go through an example where we can see the effects of a demand-side shock on the short-run fluctuations in the economy. And we want to think about how can the government respond to these demand-side shocks to help stabilize the economy and to mitigate the influence of this demand-side shock. Let's take a look. So let's consider the impact of a recession in Europe on the United States economy. Well, what does this mean? Well, we know that Europe and the US are trading partners, so they trade with one another. So if there's a recession in Europe, that's going to influence the net exports to the United States. So we want to know, how does this impact the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model for the US? What impact does that have on the price level and output in the US? And what government policies can be enacted to curb the negative effects in the US? So let's see. As we had mentioned, we would see an influence through net exports. Remember, net exports are exports minus imports. So if Europe is in a recession, that means that they're going to be producing less overall. And if they're in a recession, they're going to demand less US imports. So imports from the US to Europe. That means that exports, goods that are produced in the US that are sent over to Europe, would decrease. So what we observe is that exports are going to fall from the US, these are US exports, to Europe. So all else equal, net exports are going to fall. So what this tells us, remember, that aggregate demand is comprised of C plus I plus G plus NX. So if net exports are falling, aggregate demand is also going to fall. So here we can observe that in the short run, we move from equilibrium A to equilibrium B. We see that there's a lower price level from this demand side shock and lower output. So what this tells us is that a recession in Europe can lead to a lower price level in the United States, lower output in the United States if they're heavily impacted by the lower exports, leading to higher unemployment and perhaps a recession. So what can the US government do in response to this? Well, here we are at equilibrium B in the short run, with the lower output, higher unemployment, and lower price level. So the government wants to try to get the US economy back to the long-run equilibrium, which would be at point C. So there's two types of policies that could put into place: expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy. So in both cases, either through monetary policy or through fiscal policy, the goal is to act in a way that would shift the aggregate demand curve up and to the right. So we're trying to shift the demand curve out, or the aggregate demand curve out, to bring it back closer to the long-run equilibrium. To do this in both the monetary policy and fiscal policy perspective, we would need to expand monetary policy or expand fiscal policy. In other words, monetary policy would rely on an increase in the money supply, which would lead to a decrease in the interest rate that would affect the change in investment. So with monetary policy, we would look at an increase in the money supply, creating a decrease in the interest rate, thereby increasing investment spending. So that would affect the aggregate demand by increasing aggregate demand through the investment channel. Once again, when investment spending is closely linked or closely responds to changes in interest rates, then that change in monetary policy is going to have a stronger effect on aggregate demand. Now, let's think about expansionary fiscal policy. To shift the aggregate demand curve up and to the right, aggregate demand would need to increase. So the government can either increase government spending or it can cut taxes, or both. By doing so, it's directly influencing aggregate demand. So we can have a two-pronged approach: expansionary monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy. By enacting these policies, the government is trying to get the US economy back to the long-run equilibrium and mitigate some of the effects that a recession in Europe might have on the US economy. Now let's think of the supply side. So let's consider a situation where the price of copper skyrockets. Copper used heavily in the manufacturing, construction, and technology in the US economy. So we want to know, how would this impact the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model? Is copper, or a shortage in copper, or the change in the price of copper, going to affect the supply side or the demand side? Well, we already know by the label that this is a supply side issue. So we know that short-run aggregate supply is going to be impacted. Let's take a look. So with an increase in the price of copper, this is an input in the production of manufacturing, construction, and technology. So we observe that this would cause a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So all else equal, we would move from a long-run equilibrium at point A to a short-run fluctuation, short-run equilibrium at point B, when the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in. We would have upward pressure on the price, showing that we have inflation, and we'd have a decrease in output, meaning that production is slowing in the economy. So we'd have a rise in unemployment. So this short-run supply shock leads to higher prices, it leads to higher unemployment, and as we can see, a possible recession in the US. So here, what can the government do? Well, it's kind of faced with a problem because it needs to think about what's more important. Do I want to curb inflation that's happening because of the shock, or do I want to attack and decrease the unemployment that's occurring and thereby stimulate growth in the economy? What we see is that it can't do both. So to stimulate growth, it would need to increase the aggregate demand. That would cause an even greater push up of the inflation rate, which would create more inflation in the economy. We'll see that in 1 minute. On the other hand, if it tries to tackle inflation, well, that's going to come with policies that would cause growth to slow down even more, leading to even higher unemployment. So the government is kind of stuck. Let's take a look. So what if they choose to curb inflation? To be able to curb inflation, they're going to mainly rely on contractionary monetary policy. We can think of contractionary fiscal policy as well, but the Federal Reserve and the central bank of the economy are the ones that are really in charge of influencing inflation rates through inflation targeting. So if there's policies that are put into place for the specific purpose of curbing inflation, they're probably going to be happening through the money supply channel through the Federal Reserve or the central bank. Let's take a look. So if they're trying to curb inflation, we would need contractionary monetary policy, meaning that the money supply would decrease, telling us that interest rates would rise, which would cause a decrease in investment spending, and therefore a decrease in aggregate demand. So what do we see here? Well, we're moving from equilibrium B, the short-run supply shock, to equilibrium C. Okay, well, we've gotten back down to a price level similar to what we saw in the long-run equilibrium. We've curbed inflation. Great job. But notice what's happening here. Here we had output after the supply shock, and here we have output after the monetary policy. So what we observe is that with this contractionary monetary policy, output falls even more, meaning that there's even more unemployment. So though we curb inflation, the cost of curbing inflation is higher unemployment as output falls even further. So now let's look at our other option to try to lower unemployment. Okay? So we start off at our long-run equilibrium, the supply shock occurs, and we end up at point B with a higher price level telling us that we have higher unemployment. To be able to return to the long-run equilibrium and in terms of production, so we're getting back to the natural rate of output, back to what we call full employment in the economy, and curbing the high unemployment that occurs because of the supply shock, the government can either enact expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy, which again shifts the aggregate demand. So we can increase the money supply, which would cause a decrease in interest rates, increase in investment spending, leading to an increase in aggregate demand through expansionary monetary policy. Or we can increase government spending, directly increasing aggregate demand. Or we can decrease taxes, which increases consumption spending, which increases aggregate demand, all else equal. These expansionary policies will lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve out or to the right, so that the economy is now moving from equilibrium B in the short run to equilibrium C, which brings us closer to the long-run equilibrium at the cost of even higher inflation. So what do we observe? With expansionary monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy that try to curb the supply side shocks, we see that the economy gets closer to full employment, closer to producing at the natural rate of output, the long-run equilibrium. But the cost of stimulating growth when we already have high inflation is that the price level rises even more, and we see even higher inflation in the economy. So economists debate back and forth whether it makes sense for the government to try to intervene and stabilize the economy when we have demand side or supply side shocks. There are a couple of arguments for and against the stabilization policies that the government can enact. Let's look at the pros first. So some of the pros include that they help alleviate the negative effects in the short run of economic fluctuations on households and firms. So if the government acts to try to curb high unemployment, for example, that really helps out households and firms that, especially households and people that don't have jobs. Because if you're unemployed and you don't have unemployment benefits, well, you don't have an income to be able to buy the goods and services that you need. So with government stabilizing policies, that might help people get back into the workforce. It helps mitigate the effects of a supply shock, which leads to high inflation and high unemployment. It may help bring the economy out of a recession, and it can be implemented easily with congressional approval. Some of the cons include the fact that, well, it does take time to implement. So even though if Congress unanimously passes a stabilization policy that would help stimulate growth in the economy, it might take a little bit of time to actually affect economic outcomes. By that point, the economy may have already changed. So the impact of the fiscal policy might not be what the government initially intended. It may overshoot or undershoot target goals. It may create greater budget deficits, especially if we're stimulating growth and we're increasing government spending and cutting taxes at the same time. And some economists argue that there's automatic stabilizers already in place, including the progressive tax rate. So specifically, when we think about people's income, if the economy slows down and your incomes go down, well then automatically you're in a lower tax bracket, which means that you're paying less taxes. So with those automatic stabilizers in place, if you're paying less taxes, you might be able to spend a little bit more on goods and services. So those type of stabilizers are automatically put into place. So some economists argue that in fact, the stabilization policies are not necessary. So what have we learned in this part of the course? Well, we've talked about how the government can influence short-run fluctuations in the economy, the goal being stabilizing shocks. These shocks can come from the demand side with changes in aggregate demand, or from the supply side, changes in the short-run aggregate supply. The government can intervene with monetary and fiscal policy to either try to curb inflation or to curb unemployment rates. What we see, especially if we have a negative supply shock, that it's impossible for the government to do both. So it needs to choose what's more important, curbing inflation or stimulating growth and bringing employment back to the full employment level. As always, take a look at the textbook for more details and make sure that you can get a greater analysis and practice through reading through the problems there, and also practice with some exercises associated with this part of the course. Thanks so much for joining me.